We've all heard the phrase, it takes a village to raise a child. But the thing that we often forget is that it also takes one to support the mother.
Well, speaking of the village, this is our podcast. I'm Nicole Harlow.
And I'm Dawn Thompson. And we're here to connect you with a village of support you need from pregnancy to parenting.
So come on this journey with us as we build your village one episode at a time. Hello. I am Nicole Harlow, and I'm here tonight joined by my beautiful co-host, Dawn Thompson, and we are joined by Ashley Makan. We are going to have a really awesome conversation all about birth psychology. So Ashley, I know you are a self-proclaimed birth psychology nerd. So tell us a little bit about how you got so into this topic and your journey of motherhood so far.
Yeah, so it's very interesting how everything always comes full circle in life, and that's what I find as a theme in my birth work as well. I kind of stepped onto this path 10 years after a really traumatic 19-week miscarriage. I stepped into my subsequent pregnancy a decade later and knew I had to do things a different way. There had to be another way. I had been through the standard procedure way and it did not support me at all. So I did my research, and I, in my own hypervigilance, took all the classes and did all the things, and was going to dictate my Zen water birth, right? And I had a beautiful transformative experience. It wasn't as Zen as I expected, but neither was I at the time, you know? So I walked out of that completely fascinated by the psychological experience of birth, and completely shocked and stunned that we had not covered the psychological aspects of that experience or the transition into parenthood, matrescence, postpartum. We covered basic healing supplies, and I was prepared for that. But the massive paradigm shift was nothing I could have been prepared for. And I couldn't stop reading on the subject. I looked for everything I could find on psychology surrounding the birth and postpartum experiences. I read and read and read for about 2 years until my husband looked at me and said, "Hey, you've got this massive bookshelf dedicated to this subject. I think you need to do something with it." And that's when I became a doula. And I found that I really love to go deep in my work and my preparation with my client base. And in my community, there weren't a lot of people doing that at the time. So I was the oddball out, but I followed the poll. And I wanted to find some type of education that I could bring to my community that could support everyone in understanding the depth of this process and why it's so important to put in the work and the preparation and how rewarding it is. And that's when I discovered birth psychology. So I dove in head first. I had no expectations. I thought I was going to be learning something that would relate to my community. I had no idea I was going to be embodying something that completely shifted my self-talk, the way that I parent my daughter, the way that I work with my client base. And I never expected to see anecdotally all of this application bringing beautiful results for my clients. What I was finding was that the more that I learned about birth psychology, the more I understood that I needed to do less. And the less that I did, the more my clients stood in their power and moved seamlessly through these experiences and needed less intervention. And their babies had smoother postpartum transition. So it was just a beautiful, beautiful experience. And I've been diving into exploring the midwifery aspects of the somatic embodiment of this entire process now. So
how do you see that? How do you see that this impacts birth, like specifically, like what, like give some, we're imagining that people who are listening to this podcast are pregnant, right?
Yeah.
So what are some of the things right away from a pregnancy and birth standpoint that they should kind of be mindful of?
Yeah. So initially, prenatal bonding, connecting with your baby from the very beginning. And that seems so silly when you can't even feel your baby moving inside of you. But Something as simple as, and this really comes back down to self-awareness more than anything. Say you're having a stressful confrontation at work and you can feel your heart rate go up and your breathing is shifting and you feel anxious and it's just been a really terrible day and you're just wound tight. If you can just stop and take a moment to breathe and connect with your baby, you're going to be initiating that oxytocin release. And just, I mean, even the language of saying, hey, baby, everything is okay. We are safe. I just had a stressful moment, and stress happens sometimes, and that's okay. You know, having something as simple as that can help with your baby's development. It can also help with your relationship and your bonding, and even their early human development, like their language and fine motor skills later in pregnancy. It's really fascinating.
Well, I mean, I can attest to that after 22 years in doing this work. I could tell the number of babies that came out being really challenging when the couple was not doing well. If they went through their entire pregnancy battling, and she was sending high cortisol levels, that fight or flight constantly the whole pregnancy, that baby was typically very difficult postpartum.
Yes.
And I've never taken any of these psychology courses, but these were things that I just observed after many, many babies. You go, oh, there's something here. I also noticed this from twins that were taken early. If they were taken really early by cesarean, even if especially if there was no medical indication, those first few weeks with the newborns was really challenging. And I find that stuff so fascinating.
I think it's really important to talk about the mind-body connection and the energetics of it all, right? So we have these neurotransmitters and we think that just ends in the brain, right? But they go all through our body, and then our body is always exuding, different frequencies and energy, and our energy moves in first. So what with the womb energetics and neurosomatics, it's literally this tripod of mind, body, energy. And then obviously with birth, you add in that womb psychology and womb light and womb energy, because that's just a whole different aspect if you don't have that. But the neuro part of it and the psychology part of it is so crucial because for obvious reasons, right? We don't have to be a psychology major to know that our brains are super powerful and they direct everything. And it goes either way. So if you are bonding, if you're regulated, if you are totally in practice and embodiment of all of these things, you're going to see those results. If you're in resistance to it, if you're having those high cortisol levels, if you're having the stress, if you're having the intrusive thoughts of, all the things, right? Who hasn't at one point in their life or another, but it's going to show. It's going to show in yourself. It's going to show in your physical body. It's going to show in the baby. So I love that people are recognizing that now.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, and I think that it's so important that we also understand that this is a fluid experience, and we are going to have our highs and our lows, and that's okay. You're not supposed to be fully regulated at all times. We're supposed to be able to respond in ways that are appropriate and then come back down to our equilibriums. So lots of grace. And what I find the easiest way to kind of differentiate between these things is that when you find self-judgment or any kind of negative self-talk, that is a self-protective behavior physiologically, psychologically, and spiritually, right? So that is a cortisol response in all reality. And when we're giving ourselves grace and we're coming back down to loving ourselves, then we're getting the oxytocin in response to that. And that is growth. And
yeah. Can you talk about, I want to go into these like practical things of how this demonstrates in people's lives, and like how can they, like, say the birth environment, How can that impact if I talk about this with clients,
Mhm.
if they have someone in the room like mom or mother-in-law,
Yep.
right? And how their relationship can have a major impact if they don't feel, if the nurse that they have is feeling amazing and they love them, how that impacts their birth experience, or the opposite of that. And the same thing with their provider, like the people that are coming into the room when you're in the middle of that normal physiological process, how can that be impacted?
Yes. So the nervous system is extremely sensitive during the birthing process. We're extra aware because if you think about like a cat, when a cat goes into labor, they go and hide, right? And some of us actually respond like cats, I found. But ultimately, we're extremely sensitive. Our nervous systems are extremely aware and extra heightened. I had a client have a completely silent labor. Nobody spoke anything. And in the other room, the midwife was getting set up and talking her student through how to set up. Nobody could hear anything, not even whispers. And after her birth, she said that she remembered that. So something as simple as conversation can be distracting. I know a local chiropractor who takes her sweater off as she's going into a home to adjust somebody at a birth. And that is symbolically leaving her stuff in the car so that she can step into the space and recognize the space as sacred ground. The relationships that we have in that space are so important. Your relationship with your midwife, your relationship with your partner, do you have that deep trust? Are you able to be fully vulnerable in front of all of these people? Have you been fully vulnerable before with these people? I recently spoke to somebody who was saying that they perceive a mother who's having a subsequent child with a new man to be a new mother because she's moving through that depth of vulnerability for the first time with that person. So if you have somebody who has negative beliefs about your birth or you, or any kind of dissonance in your relationship that has not been dealt with, then it's definitely going to affect your birth space, and it does affect the physiology and the physiologic process. It's a matter of you having a stall at 5 centimeters, like I did when my midwife walked in the room and I had never met her before. And it's a matter of you having a very straightforward birth where you don't really need anyone because you've put in the preparation and everyone there is fully invested,
Yeah.
It's so interesting that you mentioned the conversation, right? So for my last birth, that was just about 7 months ago. It was my second home birth, and the same people were invited, my same doula, my same photographer, my same pelvic floor therapist, obviously my husband. And everyone knew how I drive, obviously every birth is different, but they were all surrounding me, holding me, speaking very softly in that low and slow kinesthetic whisper, let me be in my space. And then my husband comes in and is like, I was in the tub a decent amount of time. We were trying to keep the water at the right temperature. He was definitely in that like linear logistic mode. So like he would say something full volume, like, and I literally turned to him and I was like, can you shut up, please?
Yeah.
I said, and I think I even said it like in the nicest way possible, honey, shut the fuck up. Like,
Right.
because he kept throwing me off, like in my zone, and everyone else was,
right.
everyone else was like quiet. And like, even though I heard it, it wasn't too distracting. And then he would come in, and to no fault of his own, he was just trying to get things done the way men do. But, it's a testament to the birth workers and the women knowing how to hold the birthing space, and then the man coming in like, let's get stuff done.
Yeah, totally.
So I'm super grateful for him, but it's
I have an interesting story about, like, it was a client again. This was going to be her 4th baby. She had always wanted to go unmedicated, never successfully did it. She had very long births. And she just really wanted to do this and by the way, she didn't hire me until like 36 weeks or something. And, but she was just like, I am ridiculously shy. I mean, like painfully shy. And in that interview, I thought she shouldn't be going to the hospital. Like she literally cannot function in a hospital because she is so debilitatingly shy. And so I suggested in that moment that maybe she consider home birth. And these were the reasons why. And I started just talking about the psychology that Ina May Gaskin talks about in her book, Ina May's Guide to Childbirth. She goes into this whole part about fear and how it can impact your birth process. And long story short, I suggested she do home birth. When she hired a midwife the next day, she did it. She was having prodromal labor. I went to her house. She was really hesitant to even have me come to her house because she was feeling so shy. And I said, I'll just do some pressure points, do a little massage. You'll take a little nap. We'll just see what happens. And I get there. As soon as I start the massage, she drifts off to sleep, but I can see her belly now contracting like every 4 minutes, 5 minutes. And the midwife and I had said, I have a feeling this is going to be a fast birth. And I kept saying to her, like, do you think we should call the midwife? She's like, no, not yet. So we're just sitting there laboring away. Everything's fine. We're chit-chatting away. And suddenly she looks up at me after a very long contraction and she says, I don't think I can do this anymore. And I was like, oh my God, we're about to have a baby. And like that's what women do is like right when they get to that transition, I can't do this anymore. And I was like, oh my God, I'd been there for an hour and a half. and suddenly I was like calling the midwife who unfortunately was 40 minutes away. And I was like, remember how we said we thought this birth might go really fast? I think it's happened. It's happening and you need to get in the car right now. And so she started driving. She was prepared. I was already texting her, but needless to say, the midwife didn't even come close to making it. The baby was born about, I think 17 minutes later and maybe even less than that actually. And what was funny was, so I catch the baby, and her husband was downstairs the whole time, like not having any idea. And I run to the edge of the thing and I'm like, y'all need to come up here because there's a baby coming. And her whole family, kids and all, come running up. And I'm like, get in the tub. She wants a baby, she wants a water birth. So get in the tub, and out comes the baby like a few minutes later. And she said to me, gosh, what's crazy is the nurse has been the one to deliver all of my babies. She had never mentioned that before.
Yep.
And it was because the people that she delivered with were the people that she finally felt safe with. And she would have, when she felt relaxed and safe being the number one thing, she would have that massive fetal ejection. I'd never seen it so prominent as in that with this client in that moment.
That was literally Jenna's birth and even Owen's birth, I would say. He was at a birth center. So like once we got there and I got checked and, we checked in and all the things, I got in the tub 7 minutes later.
Yeah.
Fetal ejection reflex. Jenna, I had one contraction that like rocked me at 5:00, got in the shower. My husband called my doula. It was a snowstorm in March here in New Jersey, which is infamous. There's always one in March. So everyone was like 20 minutes later than normal. When I tell you my doula got there at like 7, my midwife got there maybe 10 minutes later. My boys were with my sister-in-law. They came home like maybe 5 minutes later. She was here. As soon as my body goes, not my body. My mind goes, you're safe. My body follows, right? Another like neurotransmitter thing. And whoosh, she shot out. She was born at 7:29.
Yeah.
So it was, it was wild. So I
yeah.
could relate to that.
I mean, I think that, Ina May Gaskin's book changed my life because of that whole birth psychology piece of like, I've thought to myself so many times, how many people are giving birth in a hospital, even with an epidural, and they get stuck because they fail to progress. And I've always wondered, I've always wanted to ask, did you feel safe?
Yes.
Did you feel protected? Did you feel like you were in that space of protection, right? It's like, I think about how mammals, a deer can literally stop delivering their baby if a predator comes, and they will get up and run away.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter if the head's sticking out.
I've seen someone stall at 9.5 centimeters for 12 hours over fear of tearing before.
Ah, yes.
And as soon as they overcame the fear, they had their 10-pound baby without tearing.
Right.
Yeah, our minds are very powerful. And I think that mind-body connection is integral for not just the birthing process, but mothering and parenting and just being a human being. And I think it's very easy in this society to be separate from the body. I feel like we're a very dissociated society. But it's as simple as getting down on the floor every night before bed and putting on some relaxing music and just moving and stretching your body in the way that it feels best, and just kind of tuning in to what feels right, because that's all you ultimately need. I have done all kinds of trainings. I have wrapped my brain 1,000 times over this subject, and I know the science behind it, and I know the body mechanics. And in all reality, you don't need any of that stuff if you're already in tune with your body and you have a team there that's really protecting the space and getting out of your way.
And I always talk about this with my students in WENs and clients and even just friends when I'm talking. You know, when you're in that labor space, in that birth space, it's not necessarily an out-of-body experience. Like, it feels like one. I hear a lot of people say that, oh, it's like an out-of-body experience. I'm like, no. It's the most in-body experience you've ever had. It's just that we're not used to being in our bodies so intently, because I say like, oh, we're floating heads. And I always joke on Zoom, because like we literally are floating heads when we're sitting here talking. But it's so true. We're so disconnected from our bodies. And when you're in birth, especially when it's unmedicated, you're forced. Yeah, there's no other option.
Full presence. And if you're not used to being fully present for more than 10 minutes during your daily meditation, then being forced to be present within your body as it's doing very intense things is, Yeah,
I when you're talking about being in your physical body, I'm, of course, I've got over 300 births that are like right here in the back of my head all the time. And so I immediately thought of this young mom. Gosh, I think she was 19, and no partner. So it's just me and her. And she's in the bathroom and in the shower. And all of a sudden she just like lifts her leg up and plants it on the wall. I mean, like halfway up the wall. And she was not pushing or anything. And I had to dive to catch her baby because she just, it was just like, she knew she wasn't saying anything. She was just breathing. And then we didn't even know that she was ready to have a baby. Clearly we'd gotten to the hospital like 20 minutes later and she was 6 centimeters, first baby. And she just planted her foot on the wall and that was it. And the baby just came right out. And I was like, oh, okay, here we are. We're having a baby.
It's fascinating. And from a midwifery perspective, especially from an observational perspective, it's so cool when you can just stop trying to make things happen and sit back and you watch the intuitive urges that happen. I'm thinking about, there's a documentary called These Are My Hours. My preceptor was the midwife in that documentary, and her then partner was the mother. And it's essentially a completely unhindered birth from beginning to end. And there is a point at the very end where she needs to move her body in a very unique way that is unique to her body that nobody would have known to suggest to her. at the very end in order to get her baby out. And she did it. And it was so fascinating the way that she moved her hips and arched her back backwards to make that happen. But it was an in tune aspect. It was her knowing her body and paying attention to what her body needed in that moment. And that's really the most important part about these processes.
Yeah.
Oof, I just got chills.
I know. I love this
Really
stuff
important.
so much. I think it's something we're just lacking severely, though, and in knowledge. And like I said, when I was a doula before I read Ina May's book, but I didn't really understand why anyone would choose no drugs. Like, I did not believe in any of that stuff. I was pretty Western thinking, like, I just didn't understand, like, why would anyone do that? And that's how I started my doula career, thinking that way. And then I read her book, and then I was like, oh my God, why isn't anyone described women like this? Like, how do we not know that our bodies function this way, or that we think this way, or like, you know, how much our brain impacts that process, and how people, if you've got a problematic relationship with your mother-in-law or even your own mother, and she's in the room, you're probably not going to dilate.
Yeah. And all of this is all interrelated. Like, if you embrace this type of preparation for your birth experience and you really embrace that embodiment aspect, that is going to carry over into your postpartum experience. You're not going to need to justify what you do with your baby. You're not going to have to constantly seek outside of yourself to know what is right for your baby and what your baby needs. You're not going to be questioning whether or not you can touch your baby or massage your baby or help your baby in whatever way they need. You're going to know that intuitively. And if you've moved through the birthing process and trust that intuitive connection, that mind-body connection, right? Then it's easy. It becomes easier with time, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let's dive into postpartum a little bit. We've been obviously hyper focused on the birth and pre a little bit, but I'd love to just kind of talk about how does this stuff, like you kind of, you know, led into it right there, but like, let's go into that a little bit deeper. What does that look like for postpartum from a psychology standpoint?
Yeah. So, I think it's the most fascinating part. I feel like the deeper I go into birth, the more that I realize that it is just a blip. It's just the beginning, right? And as important as it is, and it really does set the groundwork for your postpartum experience, the postpartum experience is where it's at. And we're finding evidence now that as far as matrescence, or that transition, that hormonal shift that we move through, that can last for 7 or more years after birth. So we're really moving through this embodiment process as we step into motherhood, and our brains are physically changing through the entire process. Postpartum. Give me a second.
As you're doing that, I'm going to just talk about, honestly, the entire reason I had my first unmedicated birth with Owen in 2020 was because I wanted a different postpartum experience than I had with my first, which I was all birth focused because I was so terrified of having a baby. I didn't even look past that point. And everything in my birth plan with my second was to make sure I had a postpartum experience. And that has been evolving ever since, to the point where with my fourth, I literally told everyone, like, you're not holding my baby until I feel comfortable with you holding my baby. And my parents are like, you know, they love me, they support me. But my dad's like, this is your fourth kid. Like, when are you going to just stop with these new rules and boundaries? And I'm like, when I feel comfortable. Like, and I'm so empowered because of, you know, birth 2, 3, and 4, you know, at that point 4, to be like, I don't care. I love you. You're my father. You can think you're right, but this is my postpartum and I am going to do what I feel is best. So I gave a 2-week boundary. And then at 2 weeks, I was like, I'm still not ready, you know, and it was only a couple of days later, but it was what I wanted. So
I love
had that first, there would have been no way that
Yeah.
I would have been able to communicate that.
Yeah.
Boundaries, solid, fortified relationships are integral. I think we're in this nuclear family focused society to where we do everything perfectly and it's on Instagram, right? And in reality, we're just suffering silently behind closed doors without any support. So building those relationships prenatally is extremely important. But like even going back to what we were talking about in birth, the mind-body connection, the ability to be fully present for long periods of time, that is just going to expand in a greater way in postpartum because you're sitting on a couch with a newborn baby and getting to know that person and learning lactation with that new person. And that's going to shift with every person, every baby that you have. But really, knowing your body, understanding what your needs are, and making sure that your needs are met. Who is it? January Harshi. I don't know if you guys are familiar with her and her work, but she said something. I'm going to completely ruin this quote, but she talks about how postpartum takes you further away from the person you've always been and brings you closer to the person that you are meant to become. And it's really just a matter of being able to sit in the discomfort of these massive transitions and be okay with all of it and understand that it's all completely normal and okay. And that if you focus on presence and connection and awareness, then you're going to transform in ways that you could never imagine, you know?
Well, I think too, it's like, I think, you underestimate that transformation and I think women we don't talk about it enough about how you're quite literally like this whole get back to yourself thing, get back to your body, your baby, pre-baby body, your pre-baby life and all that. It's non-existent. That does not exist anymore. And you're likely causing yourself actually a tremendous amount of turmoil even thinking that that's possible.
Yeah.
But also that loss of self, man, we don't talk about that enough. It's like, that's so hard. It's so hard to lose that independent thinking person or the life that you had before having a baby. And we're supposed to feel grateful because some people can't have babies and, and it's like, okay, but I can still feel this.
Yeah.
I can still mourn that loss.
Yes.
I think our society is so focused on who we're offending and an external, oh my gosh, I don't want to say the wrong thing. I don't want to offend someone. I want to be grateful for what I have. But we're also it's valid to feel all the feelings. It's valid to go through these shifts, these transformations. I'm 7 months postpartum. My baby just cried upstairs and my pull is I have a sweatshirt on, so you won't see my boobs leaking, but I'm sure it's a biological pull that we have. And our society says, shut the door on it. Don't show anyone this. But the most liberating thing that I've been able to experience is really that full embodiment of, hey, I'm a new mom and I'm giving myself grace. And if you choose not to, that's your problem, not mine, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And the connection with baby, like you're talking about, it's a weird connection. My daughter is 7 and she can breathe wrong in the other room and I'm up. I can feel it. And for the first 6 months postpartum at minimum, their nervous systems are underdeveloped. They don't even know that they are separate from our nervous systems for 6 months. And if we're putting the effort in to really focus on connection and build that, we're actually setting the tone for what their next hormonal shift will be when they step into teenager land. So we're really we're setting attachment goals prenatally before our babies are born in through the first few years of life. And this is affecting our relationship and their development and the whole transition and how our relationship looks for the rest of our lives. Ultimately, there's so much really cool research that looks at things 40 years apart, and you can tell the difference between relationships based upon how birth and postpartum and early parenthood went.
All right. Well, I'm going to just dip my little toe into something controversial because you're talking about it a little bit, but like attachment parenting and the psychology related to that, because I think that and I'm really going to get controversial in the fact that you know, having all of these different contraptions and we just keep moving our babies from one contraption to the next, from a swing to a bouncy to the so that we can get stuff done and all of that. And I'd love to understand your psychology part of that. But what I can say anecdotally about that is that my last and final child, now remember, I had 2 children long before I had I was a doula. And then I had 2 more children many, many years after being a doula, and changed my entire thinking. Right. Yeah. And my last baby, my last 2 were only 13 months apart. So that was interesting. And my last baby, I did it out of necessity, mind you. I wasn't doing it out of like some righteous, you know, whatever, educational, whatever. But I literally wore him probably his entire first year. Every nap practically, like I just wore him, and I nursed him until he was 3.5. I'd not nursed any of my other children that long. And the kid is the healthiest, most balanced, most regulated, all of the things.
Yeah.
And he's 14 now. And I'm like, I mean, I guess we should probably, you know, right? It's probably too much to have a conversation in right now, but
dive in and
kind of touch. I know we only have like 5 minutes left, unfortunately. I didn't realize that. Thanks for that heads up, Nicole. But, you know, maybe we could just touch on it.
Yeah. So attachment, again, begins in the womb. We're finding evidence now that fine motor skills, language skills, mental acuity, all of these things, self-regulation even, directly correlate with prenatal bonding. And that is connecting with your baby, playing with your baby in the womb. It's simple stuff. We've found some really cool research where they read the same book over and over and over again to the baby in the 3rd trimester, and baby recognized this same book and showed agitation when you skipped a page. And the same thing with music and a song. So all of these things directly affect the early relationships. And if we emphasize that, like what you saw, Dawn, is anecdotally exactly what I'm talking about. It speaks for itself. And there's no shame if you didn't do it that way either. I mean, again, my daughter was my Velcro baby, and fortunately she was, and I followed my instincts with that. But my daughter was 3 when I learned about all of these things, and I didn't ruin her. You can't ruin your kids before they come out. It just gives you insight in how you can better support them in their development, whether they're 14 or 4. So ultimately, yes, the attachment parenting really does give us a heads up on the whole process. And yes, there is a difference between attachment parenting and permissive parenting too. Boundaries are good and important. And of course, you have to worry about that in early parenting, but it's something that you step into, I think, sooner than you realize. Yeah.
Well, that seems like that might be our next episode with you, Ashley.
Yeah.
Really, I think that's probably something we should take a dive into from a psychological standpoint, not just a philosophical one.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
I would love to.
So, Ashley, speaking of the village, besides your role as a student midwife and executive director of this birth psychology, which role would you say is your non-negotiable, is the most important in the village?
Now, as somebody who's very biased and who has worn many hats, I have been mulling over this, and I genuinely think that it is the doula, but not because of what the doula does in the birth space, because of what the doula does in the community space. We have really struggled with building community and coming back to the village in the last several years. And my community has directly worked very, very hard since I stepped into this work to create community and village and those connections so that the mothers are taking care of each other and they're not dependent upon provider after provider after provider and all of these specializations that's based upon privilege more than anything. And they're thriving. And it's the coolest thing to watch when you have your gatherings and your birth circles and you just have the space holding and you know how to hold space effectively. And I think that's the biggest thing that you can do in this work. I think that's the most effective work that you can do is build community and be a good ear and listen.
Which is why we're called Speaking of the Village, right?
Yes.
It's why this podcast, it's why we're doing this podcast, because that's exactly how we feel. It's like we've lost the village in just a couple of generations, and the women are the ones left holding the bag.
Yeah.
And it's not okay, and we need to figure out how to get it back.
I think it all starts with the women, though. And I think that if we figure out how to build our villages back, then we're going to be unstoppable.
Yeah.
Well, Ashley, thank you so very, very much. This was such a cool conversation. And I have a feeling we'll be doing this again because I think we need to take even a bigger dive into some of these things. So if you've joined us today, if you have any questions, there'll be how to get in touch with Ashley will be in the show notes, and any other links and stuff that we can offer. We talked about a couple of different things, books and everything. So just check the show notes for that. And as always, have a great day. And we appreciate you being here.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hey, thanks for joining us on Speaking of the Village. If you love today's episode, make sure to hit subscribe and share it with a friend.
And remember, you're not alone. We're here, we're listening, and we're all in this together because in our village, no mom walks alone.